KSFO. Saturdays 5 to 7, Sundays 4 to 7. Our phone number is 808-5600. Keep it handy. We have a guest this hour about a topic that we have talked around and about, and I brought it up the last hour as well because I'm keeping an eye on things that are going on in our area, but this is going on across the country, and it has to do with an attack on our cities, an attack on how we live. You know, we all complain about, they can't tell us what kind of toilets we have and low-flow faucets and our garbage cans, this and that and the other thing. Well, you would be astonished, you would be shocked if you knew what is already in the law and allowed and the changes that have been made behind the scenes. Because, as I said earlier, if you don't go to the town council meetings, you don't know what they're doing. And in many cases, you don't know what they're doing anyway because they hide it effectively. But we've talked about it here, and Stanley Kurtz has written a book that just nails this whole thing, and it's just terrific. It's called Spreading the Wealth, How Obama is Robbing the Suburbs to Pay for the Cities. Stanley Kurtz is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington. He is the key contributor to public debates on a whole variety of issues, from marriage and family, education reform, religion and public life, and a whole variety of things. He writes for a number of publications. He's a contributing editor for The Corner at National Review Online, writes for the Weekly Standard and others in this terrific book that he has out. And it is so timely because of what we've talked about here on this program. Stanley Kurtz, thank you very much for being with us here on KSFO.
Barbara, thanks so much for having me.
You know, when I read about your book, I thought, this is absolutely perfect because we have an outfit here, and you probably are familiar with it, the Association of Bay Area Governments, ABAG, which is one of these unelected groups that is deciding what our communities are going to look like, demanding housing, demanding certain types of transportation, and it's not just here. This is all over the country, isn't it?
Absolutely, Barbara, and I think conservatives are not as aware, perhaps, around the nation as the conservatives in California that this is going on, and when they do see it going on, I'm not sure they fully understand the agenda behind it. So what this book does is to talk about the movement called the Regional Equity Movement, or sometimes just regionalism for short, because it turns out that Barack Obama, for decades, has been a part of this movement and has been pushing its ideas in federal policy, and basically the country doesn't know about it. No one's debating this as an aspect of national policy, and people aren't even very aware locally of what the real agenda is. And the bottom line, and we can go into this, but the bottom line is that this regional equity movement really wants to abolish the suburbs. Originally, they wanted to do it literally by having cities just outright annex the suburbs around them. But since that's illegal in most states and politically impossible at any rate, they've come up with all of these roundabout ways to undercut the political and economic independence of the suburbs. That's what this is really about, not so much ecology, which is what you hear about in the news.
Well, what's happening in our area, of course, is if there's any little bit of open space somewhere or forcing, we have a lot of ranchers in our area as well, that they try to get them to dedicate the land so that it'll never be developed, and that's supposed to be a wonderful thing. But what they're doing is, by doing that, you're driving up the cost of housing on top of it because there's less land available for development because development has become a bad word.
Absolutely, Barbara, but again, they usually talk about this in terms of ecology. We're going to preserve that rural land.
Right.
Or we don't want you to commute out to the suburbs because your car exhaust is going to cause global warming. And of course, there are many people who are perfectly sincere in believing that, whether we agree with them or disagree with them. But what I've discovered here is that these regionalists, and there are many of them, there's certainly many of them in California, are deeply committed to undercutting the suburbs, and they really have a sort of a three-part plan, broadly speaking. One of them is to try to force suburbanites back into the city or prevent people in the cities who want to move out to the suburbs from doing that. So by preserving that rural land from development, they're really making it impossible to build suburbs or exurbs. That's the core goal. And what's the purpose of that? Because they want to drive the suburbanites back to the city where they'll bring their tax money with them. And so part one of the plan is really to get the suburbanites to move back to the cities through a combination of development boundaries and various taxes and fees on driving and parking to make it difficult to have that suburban commute and develop in concentrated ways in the cities and have people travel by public transportation in these dense cities. And so that's part one. And part two
I'll tell you what, hold your thought right there, because we have to take a... No, we don't have to take a break. Go ahead, continue with that. My mistake.
Well, the second part of the plan is to have the urban poor move out to the suburbs. How do you undercut the suburbs? First, get the suburbanites to go back to the city, and second, get people in the city to go out to the suburbs. And we saw this in Westchester County in New York State. The Obama administration came down very hard on Westchester County, which hadn't been discriminating in its housing policy, but nonetheless they came up with a clever lawsuit to force Westchester County to pay for low-income housing developments, to try to change laws so that landlords would have to accept people with public income, public housing vouchers. And the Obama administration has promised to expand this to suburbs around the country, including Marin County in the Bay Area. So
have they done it yet?
They haven't done it yet. They're waiting to the second term, but they've already promised, and they actually target the more liberal Democratic suburbs first because they know those are the ones least likely to put up resistance to a Democratic administration. And so
let me just ask you, before we get on with this, because this is fascinating, on what grounds does the Obama administration, the guy running the country, how do they sue and force a local community to do something like that? On what grounds do they have legal basis to do that?
Well, when communities take certain kinds of federal aid, they sign a form and part of the sort of language on that form says, we promise to affirmatively further the goal of having more low-income housing. And up to now, nobody has interpreted that to mean that they had to move in this a very aggressive way to spend thousands and even millions of dollars to fund low-income housing and to change all of their laws, which had been publicly voted on as to who can accept public. But the Obama administration very specifically moved to have a very broad interpretation of that document that people signed. Actually, it was a civil rights group that had this very experimental suit, and then the Obama administration heavily came in behind them and pressed this Democratic-leaning county with the specific goal of setting a new kind of precedent for what they could force on other suburbs using this language from the Federal Housing Act about affirmatively furthering. And so even though you don't have to prove any discrimination here at all, simply by signing the affirmatively further promise in conjunction with accepting federal aid, they now have this big array of things that they can try to force a suburb to do.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, part one, but see, the reason I keep going with this part one, part two, part three is because
do it, please.
People see all of these separate policies and they don't quite understand where it's going and what the motivation is. But it's all to undercut the suburbs. So if part one is all of these environmental laws and tactics that are really meant to force suburbanites back to the city so their tax money goes there. Then part two is to send low-income urbanites out to the suburbs. Part three is to redistribute the money of the remaining suburbanites to the cities. There's a practice called regional tax-based sharing that right now only exists in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region, although if Proposition 31 passes, and I hope we can talk about this, it's going to come to California. And regional tax-based sharing means that in Minneapolis-St. Paul, for example, that all the municipalities in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region have to kick in a huge chunk of their tax receipts to a common regional pot, and that gets redistributed by population. So the upshot is that the suburbs are constantly funneling a huge chunk of their tax money to the cities. So if you force suburbanites back to the city, and if you first force the urban poor out to the suburbs, and if you redistribute the wealth of the remaining suburbanites to the city, even though the political boundaries will still exist, in effect you've, in a sense, abolished the suburbs, even without formal annexation. And that's the real plan.
How do they get the city poor to move to the suburbs? What technique do they use for that?
This is the Westchester County thing, where they basically force a prosperous suburban county or area to build millions of dollars worth of low-income housing. They change regulations that landlords could no longer turn down people with public housing vouchers, and then they forced the suburb to affirmatively go out to cities and advertise this low-income housing.
Wow.
And so,
oh, goodness.
So literally this movement is hostile, and this is a movement, by the way, that Barack Obama has been a member and supporter of for over 2 decades. This is, as I discovered in researching this Spreading the Wealth, the book, Barack Obama, the community organizers who trained him and who he later supported from his liberal foundations that he sent all of this foundation cash to, these community organizers were the shock troops of the regional equity movement. They were the grassroots activists. This was the focus of their work. Nobody has really known this up to now. What exactly were these community organizers doing? It turns out that they were pushing this movement that didn't like the suburbs, and Obama was deeply a part of this movement. And what I show in the book is that this isn't all in his past. He's not only pursuing the very same policies today from the White House that he and his community organizing mentors were working on for decades, but he's actually working with those old radical Alinskyite community organizers. It's not just all in his past. They're literally working with him in the White House and with his top administration officials and shaping administration policy, and none of this has been reported.
No, and I mean, you think of all the different departments, the EPA and all of those agencies are pushing this.
Transportation.
That's right. That's right.
And that's what's going on, and these community organizers are shaping the policies in all of those agencies, and nobody knows it.
I was thinking of, we've talked a lot about, not in as much detail and not as expansive as you have, and then you're talking about the regionalism, and I want to talk more about that, but we have all been hit with this business of, putting in the affordable housing, and I've gone to meetings and said, well, now, what do you mean by affordable housing? What makes it affordable? At what point? And nobody knew the answers. And when does it stay affordable housing forever, or does it come to a point when it can revert to market value housing? Nobody has any answers. They're like the blind leading the blind and just following right off over the cliff. They haven't gotten to the point of advertising to bring the poor people from the city into the suburbs, but that's the next step after they get the housing built, right?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. And this was positively mandated by the Obama administration in Westchester County. Now, it's interesting as well that Westchester County actually flipped from a Democratic to a Republican county. They were so angry at this federal attack, essentially, that they elected a county leader who was Republican, and he fought the Obama administration in court and got at least some of these aggressive policies from the Obama administration reversed, although many of them remained. So this is politically very sensitive, and that's why you often won't hear, again, the dots don't get connected. People don't say, we really don't like suburbs, and that's why we're doing all this.
Yes, exactly.
And, they do it on a piece-by-piece basis, and people have never heard of the policies, and they really don't understand what's going on. But in fact, there is a developed movement, and it's very well funded by all these left-leaning foundations, and they know what their big-picture plan is, but the public in general doesn't. And perhaps the ultimate example of all of this is Prop 31, which I would love to tell you about, because I wrote this book knowing nothing about Prop 31. And in the book I said, there's a movement that wants to undercut the suburbs, and one of the key elements is regional tax-based sharing. They want to redistribute the wealth of the suburbs to the cities. And lo and behold, the book comes out, and only then do I discover that right now on the ballot in California, there is a proposition that would usher in this whole thing, regional government in a formal way, focused on tax-based sharing, to grab a hold of the money from the suburbs and send it to the cities. It would really completely transform the face of local government in California. And the worst part of it is, and this is really, to me, just jaw-dropping, that this whole proposition is being debated. And until recently, when a few of us exposed this, no one was talking about these revolutionary regionalist provisions. They were talking about provisions that were on a completely different topics. And so this really was a kind of stealth regionalist proposition. It really is undemocratic the way this is being done. And you write a book and say that some of these regionalists are stealthy and don't want to tell you what they're all about. People say, well, is that a conspiracy theory? And here we are in California with a proposition that's going to truly transform California's constitution and system of local government. And it's been on the ballot, and no one's been honestly talking about it.
No, we haven't. I haven't done a lot on the propositions yet on my program. I usually do, and I will admit to you fully that I have not read Prop 31 when I saw somebody.
No one has.
Yeah, when I saw
too long and complicated.
your columns on the corner in National Review, it just boggled my mind, and also the fact that the local newspaper out here supported it, and you showed why they clearly didn't know what they were talking about. Before we get into that, define for me and for my listeners, what is regionalism?
So
what are we talking about?
Regionalism is this movement that would really ultimately like to eliminate suburbs, and the way they ideally want to do it is just to have cities annex suburbs, but right now that's illegal and politically impractical, so they look for all these other ways. That was sort of the step one, step two, step three, to undercut the political and economic independence of the suburbs, and there are different ways to do it, but they all boil down to pushing suburbanites toward the cities, pushing the urban poor out to the suburbs, and redistributing the wealth of the remaining suburbanites. And there are different strategies for doing this, and one of them, which is embodied in Prop 31, is to literally create regional governments that would swallow up. You see, if you can't have a city literally annex the suburbs, you could create a regional authority, and you mentioned this at the beginning of the show.
Yes.
You can create a regional authority that encompasses both the city and the suburban governments, and you can gradually give it more and more power and authority. And so without having the city literally annex the suburbs, you will have, in effect, swallowed up the city and suburbs into the same government. So you create a kind of shell government that doesn't have too much in the way of powers, and then you use the federal government and other techniques to build and build and build the power of that regional government until pretty soon it's become the real power, and the cities and suburbs have become hollow shells.
Do you envision, if this were carried out to its extreme, that it could also change the role of states? I mean, I travel around the country a fair amount over the last few years, and what has struck me about looking at, quote, the suburbs of cities around the country, everything looks the same. I mean, it used to be where towns had character, and, this town looked like this because of the people who lived there and the history, etc. Now everything looks alike. The houses are designed exactly the same. The streets are laid out the same. Little by little, any individuality is getting lost, and I'm just wondering if you took it to its most extreme, could you do that to the states as well?
Well, first of all, I think in general you're right that, obviously when you have regulations that stem from a common strategy, a national strategy, that's going to tend to make everything uniform because everything has to answer to the regulations. Now, you ask a very interesting question about the states. The ideal of the regionalists really is to have the federal government control everything, but they have to work around the fact that America has a federalist system. Now, it's a funny thing about our federalist system in the United States. The key layer in the Constitution is, and too often we ignore all this, of course, but the way the Constitution was written, any power that wasn't specifically given to the federal government was supposed to be reserved for the state.
Right.
Now, in addition to that, the states had all of these local governments within them. That wasn't actually formally written into the Constitution. Technically, the Constitution gives all the power to the states, but we had this very powerful tradition that the states respected, that the localities had control of whatever they could deal with, and only what was remaining would go to the states. But because the Constitution is written in such a way that technically the states have all power, that is why on something like regional tax-based sharing and on all these plans to undercut the control that the suburbs have of their own municipalities, these regionalists want to go to the state, to get the state legislature, or in the case of Prop 31, to get a proposition to countermand local control. So this could build up, the regionalist movement could build up the power of the states And then, but because a lot of that is running through the state, in effect, you would be tending to make the state itself all powerful. And since another big tactic, and this is where Obama comes in, and this is why I wrote so much in the book about Obama, another goal is to push this regionalism through the federal government as well. So it really is a plan to work from the ground up on a piece-by-piece basis to undercut the entire federal system and to make everything, all power, move closer and closer to the center. And that will tend to build up the federal level, it'll build up the state level, it'll build up the regional level, and the most local level will be the level that is gutted.
You know, it's interesting we're talking about the role of the state in this. What we're going through out here in AB 32, which was signed by Schwarzenegger, which is this California's climate control bill, which is just affecting everything. I mean, communities are having to come up with their climate control policies, how to reduce their carbon footprint, and all of this type of thing. And the hook on that is, what happens if they don't do it? They take their transportation money away from them. So, I mean, that's the state cooperating in this type of thing. And you're right, one hand is holding the other.
And that's how this Prop 31 works, and that's how Obama works at the federal level. For example, in this book, Spreading the Wealth, I talk about the Common Core. People don't understand. This is really an amazing thing. People don't realize that Obama has created a national school curriculum. It hasn't come down yet. It's going to come down only in the second term. But 45 of the 50 states have signed on in principle to the idea of a national curriculum. It's going to be a left-leaning curriculum. It's going to dumb down standards. It's going to be used in this effort to redistribute suburban education funding to the cities. I talk about it all in my book, but the reason that I bring it up is because the way Obama was able to achieve this, supposedly the states signed on to it voluntarily, but what happened was Obama said, if you want to get federal aid for education through Race to the Top, you have to sign on to this national curriculum, even though I'm not going to tell you what the curriculum actually is. And because we're in an economic crisis and the states are very hard up, they signed on, even conservative states, even states that were run by Republicans.
Oh, listen, Stanley, it's because it's for the children. And it's for the children, they'll sign anything. That's the problem. And you know something? I've gone to the school board meetings that I have attended just recently in one community. They are in the midst of exactly right now training their teachers and all of their staff for this new school curriculum, which you're talking about. We have to take a break right now. Save your thought. When we come back, I want to talk about that proposition because that's something I suspect nobody knows about. You're absolutely right. I'm Barbara Simpson. If you're just joining us, we're speaking with Stanley Kurtz. His book is called Spreading the Wealth, How Obama is Robbing the Suburbs to Pay for the Cities. The publisher is Sentinel. You've got to look at it. It's absolutely shocking if you don't know anything about it. And if you've listened to my show, you know something about it. We'll be right back. We're getting in deeper and deeper in this. And the more I hear Stanley Kurtz talking about what his book is about, and I relate it to the kinds of things that are happening to us here in our local communities and certainly in our state, it's shocking. And he made reference to California's Proposition 31, which I will admit to you I had not read yet. Stanley Kurtz, the book is called Spreading the Wealth, How Obama is Robbing the Suburbs to Pay for the Cities. Now, my information that I have so far at least says that it is it's partially a constitutional amendment for California. It's called the State Budget, State and Local Government Initiative Constitutional Amendment and Statute, which to most people is gobbledygook. So what does it do? It's a constitutional amendment and a state statute. What does that mean?
You know, Barbara, they throw everything in there but the kitchen sink.
Yes.
And what ends up getting talked about whenever people debate Prop 31 tends to be the simplest, least important provision. It's not a trivial provision, but it's the only one people understand. So that's the one they talk about, which says if you want to pass something in the California legislature, you'll have to publicly say what the bill actually says 3 days before it's passed by the legislature. This is to stop the practice of gut and amend, where they change the bill at the very last minute and amend it without really broadcasting to the public what the bill is all about. That is a good idea, and that is the one idea that they emphasize when they talk about this massive, revolutionary 23-page bill. This is the sort of bait that they put out there to make everyone think series of regional governments that will be little super governments that stand over groups of cities and suburbs, and effectively it's going to force the suburbs to share their tax money with the cities. Just like I said earlier, the suburbs in Minneapolis, St. Paul do it. But they just, not only do they not talk about this part of the bill, and when I say they, I mean even the proponents of the bill greatly downplay this part of the bill. Sometimes they don't even mention it at all. When they do mention it, you can't follow what's going on. I also mean that the supposedly nonpartisan services that summarize the bill usually completely omit the fact that this is about tax sharing. But instead of the Minneapolis-St. Paul program, where the legislature passed a law that very openly said, suburbs, you're going to have to kick in your tax money and it's going to go to the cities. These people were much smarter, the ones who created Prop 31. They make it sound like it's voluntary. They make it sound like local governments are in control. They say if a bunch of local governments want to get together and cooperate with each other to create one of these regional collectivities of government, that's just great. They can do that, and they can share their taxes. But what people don't understand is that they do just what Obama did. How does Obama get schools to adopt this national curriculum? He does it in two ways. He says, I'll give you a waiver to No Child Left Behind, so you don't have to follow all of the tough regulations in No Child Left Behind, and I'll give you some federal aid. So he gives them these carrots, and that's the same thing that Prop 31 does. If these cities and suburbs throw in together and share their tax money, then they get bonus money from the state. That's a carrot of a reward. And they also get the right to write some of their own versions of onerous state regulations, which will in effect let them write lax versions of regulations. They'll be able to get themselves out of some tough regulations. And so, but the only people that can do that are the suburbs and city governments that throw in with this tax sharing idea. So what's going to happen is that the cities that are failing and going bankrupt are going to create a little group there with some of the less well-off suburbs around them. They're going to share a little tax money. They're going to get a big monetary reward from the state for that, and they're going to be able to write themselves out of some difficult regulations. The more prosperous suburbs won't want to join because they'll realize that if they join, then they'll have to give all their tax money to the city that is going bankrupt, which is the real purpose of the amendment. But when that happens, they'll have to follow all the tough regulations. They won't get any of the money. In fact, the money that will be funneled to these special groups as a reward is going to be coming out of the pockets of those suburbs. And pretty soon, the legislators who are from the cities and from the suburbs that throw in with the cities, they'll realize that if they pass some tough regulation, the people in their districts will be able to get themselves out of it. And so they'll start passing really tough regulations on all the suburbanites, and they'll turn the suburbanites who don't want to join into these groups that share taxes into second-class citizens is what it's going to do.
You mentioned the newspaper, the Contra Costa Times, supported this. Are you finding that newspapers around the state are supporting it? I'll be honest with you, I haven't followed it, so I don't know.
They're very divided. For one thing, a lot of the newspapers are totally confused. And there are and there's one other key provision of the bill I need to talk about because it explains some of the confusion. The bill also gives the governor the right to declare a fiscal emergency, and if the legislature doesn't solve that in a way that agrees, that the governor and the legislature can agree on, the governor has the power to unilaterally start making cuts in the budget. This is what Schwarzenegger tried to get, and he was turned down. And so a lot of the liberals don't like that. They're afraid of that. And some of the conservatives see that, and they say, okay, this is great. The liberals don't like it, so we'll be for it. But neither side, liberal or conservative, pays attention to the fact of what's really going on with two-thirds of the bill, which is this whole thing about undercutting the suburbs.
And so to get the one thing, they're taking the carrot, and they're not noticing the fact that there's arsenic at the other end of it.
Exactly. And this is really coming from a guy named Bob Hertzberg, who used to be the Speaker of the California Assembly.
That's right.
A Democrat. And he's the co-chairman of a group called California Forward, which is the group who wanted to redistribute the wealth of the suburbs to the cities, they laid down in this report all the plans that in effect have gone into this Prop 31.
And now we're facing in November, and nobody really knows what it is. We're going to take another quick break. We'll be right back with my guest, Stanley Kurtz. His book, Spreading the Wealth, How Obama is Robbing the Suburbs to Pay for the Cities. That means taking your money. That's what he's talking about. I'm Barbara Simpson, 808-5600. Barbara Simpson here at Hot Talk 560 KSFO. We're speaking with my guest, Stanley Kurtz, about his terrific book, Spreading the Wealth. Stanley, let's get a couple of callers in, and then I have a question I want to ask you as well. Jeff is calling us from Cupertino. Jeff, a quick question for my guest on KSFO.
Yeah, hi, Barbara. Hi, Mr. Kurtz. Pleasure to be on.
Hey, Jeff.
You know, there's always been a tradition in the United States, and especially in California, that there's kind of a home rule aspect to community planning, and that home rule brings it back down to the local level, and I think that's going to be predominant in this entire transformation that you're addressing.
What is your question?
Well, no, my statement is if we do it right, and if we market it appropriately, that we're going to satisfy the citizenry, and we're going to be just fine in regards to changing things a little bit.
Let me just put my 2 cents in, and then I'll let Stanley Kurtz comment on that. Jeff, thank you for that. But the fact remains is we're already away from home rule. You have no idea of the movement we have made. I've been involved in it. I've gone to meetings. I've had guests in my programs. And I followed it on my own, just what's happening in our area. They're getting further and further away from home rule already. Stanley Kurtz, go ahead. You have a comment on that.
Well, absolutely, Barbara. Though everything I've been talking about is the antithesis of home rule, and I'll give you another really important example. There's really so much bad, it's hard to get it all in.
Yeah.
Part of the problem with this is that under Prop 31, the regional governments that are created, the committee that would control the regional area would not be actually elected by the full population of that area. So I call it redistribution without representation. So these local governments that got together would appoint a committee. So the officials would not have been elected. The officials who were in charge of redistributing this money would not have been elected by the publics that they control.
Yeah.
So it couldn't be further from the American tradition than this.
Yeah, I think it's just wishful thinking on Jeff's part. Let's go quickly to Jay in San Francisco. What's your question for my guest, Stanley Kurtz, Jay?
Yes, Barbara, thank you for having Stanley Kurtz, his book, Spreading the Wealth, and I wanted to ask him about, President Obama's timeline, but I want to say I've done my homework. I've heard him 3 times. I checked his website, National Review, and he talks about Barack Obama's mentor, Gamaliel, which is Wikipedia, Michelle Malcolm, but then the Sustainable Cities, they have the community organizing group. Well, they blog right into whitehouse.gov, and the president celebrates that Sustainable Cities, and they have like 2 dozen websites with links to HUD and Department of Transportation, so
it's just permeating everything.
Partnerships already.
Do you have a question?
Already set up.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to ask him, can he tell us, there's a dozen websites where the government's already linking doing this.
Give us a question.
Pennsylvania.
Give us a question.
The timeline is when is the HUD and Department of Transportation going to start implementing these?
Okay.
They're already doing it right.
Good question. Go ahead, Stanley.
What Jay is talking about, I think, is what's called, I talk about it in the book, it's called the Sustainable Communities Initiative. This is a very important federal program, but because the name sounds like gobbledygook, and because it doesn't kick in until the second term, no one's paid any attention to it. But what Obama has done is to fund all of these so-called smart growth people, all of these anti-suburban types, to put out a regional plan, and in the second term, if he's reelected, he'll be able to withhold federal funding unless localities go along with that plan. So, in effect, it'll bring the federal government in on behind all of the forces that are pushing this regionalism on California and all the other states. And one of the things I'm doing in the book is just trying to alert the people to the existence of this, because no one knows about it, but it potentially could be just as transformative of the country as Obamacare.
Exactly. What is the Gamaliel Foundation?
The Gamaliel Foundation is the community organizing network that Obama himself helped to found, and the organizers behind that network were the leaders of this regionalist movement. And what I explain in the book, and again, it's never been reported, the people who used to run the Gamaliel Foundation just created a new name, a group called Building One America, just like Corn used to spin off all of these groups with different names, so you couldn't follow what was really happening.
Right.
So Obama's working with the same organizers, the same radical organizers who backed this regionalism when he was a radical fellow back in Chicago, right now from the White House. It's just that they changed the name of the group, but it's really the same thing. So all the people who say, well, all that radical stuff was in Obama's past, no, it's going on right now, and that's what I explain in the book, and it's all about this regionalism.
What reaction have you had to your book? How long has it been out?
The book has been out for, I'd say, about 6 weeks now.
Okay.
And I actually did get, there have been some very positive reviews from conservatives, but I actually did get 2 responses from liberals, because when it first came out, I got a fair amount of publicity. I had some articles, and one of them hooked on to this phrase I used earlier on your program, abolish the suburbs, and said, well, that's ridiculous. Obama's not going to abolish the suburbs in the second term. And I explained when I wrote my reply to that is, yes, I know he's not going to completely abolish the suburbs in the second term, but this movement really did begin with people who wanted to annex the suburbs and literally eliminate them. The fellow who started it was named David Rusk, who's still advising the White House.
I was going to say, he's still there.
He's still there, and he wrote a book called Cities Without Suburbs, and it's terribly important to know that their long-term goal, even if they know it's something they can't achieve except for a full generation of time, but you have to know that their goal is really to get rid of suburbs, to understand all the little pieces of the puzzle. But again, they jump on to the thing and say, well, that's crazy, Obama's not going to abolish the suburbs, that could never happen. In the second term, he's never said anything that extreme. But the point is, the very people who have that as a long-term goal and have a realistic incremental plan for achieving that over a long period of time, they're working with the White House and they're being supported by the White House. So that was my response. But, they try to say that you're just an alarmist and it's all crazy. And so they jumped onto that phrase, but they really couldn't do much to dispute what I was actually arguing in the book. The other reply said, well, this is mostly an issue for localities, not the federal government. And I explained, well, that's true, but look at the Sustainable Communities Initiative. The point is, Obama's bringing the strength of the federal government to assist all of these local movements. So they didn't, I don't think, obviously I'm biased, but I didn't think their replies were particularly devastating. The interesting thing is that they even bothered to reply because some of the articles I did to describe the core ideas of the book when it came out got quite a lot of attention, quite a lot of play, and that worried them a little, and so they tried to come after the book. But for the most part, of course, it's been responded to more by conservatives who are very happy with it. But Mitt Romney's campaign has been very cautious about attacking Obama in any strong way, and so, that means that the kind of thing I'm laying out there is something that so far would not be taken up into the campaign as something conservatives know about, but that Romney, I think, is afraid to, at least for now, bring this sort of stuff up because they're afraid of alienating.
Oh, they'll attack him. They'll just tear him to shreds because it's the kind of thing that they couldn't believe anybody would be trying to do. But, when I saw your book and realized what you were writing about, and I realized that I'm living through this here in Northern California now. I've seen it on the local level.
Californians understand me. That's the thing, is the easiest stations to understand, even though they haven't heard about Prop 31, the California radio people, and this happens nationally, but especially in California, whenever I come on, they start telling me all the stories about what's happening to them. They've all got the stories. It's amazing. I get an education just by going on all these radio shows.
I'll bet. We got a call from Madison, who's calling from San Jose. Quick question, Madison, for my guest, Stanley Kurtz.
Hi, this regionalism sounds like a little bit like the Open Space Authority, and I was wondering if there was any way we could get rid of the Open Space Authority.
Well, I don't know particularly about the Open Space Authority, but it sounds like it could well be connected. As we said earlier in the radio show, part of this movement is to try to prevent from taking place in undeveloped areas so people can't create more suburbs or exurbs, and so it's very likely that this is part of the regionalist movement. Since I don't know the details of it, but
it's all part of the same thing, Madison, and that's the problem. It's like a spider web, and it's all connected in different ways. But their whole accomplishment is what Mr. Kurtz has been talking about from his book. In terms of the proposition Do you have a sense of the? I haven't seen any polling on it because I haven't looked. I'll be honest. Do you know what the polling is showing? Look like it's going to pass? Because it make it. You said it was what 26 pages.
Yeah,
this
like
thing,
that.
and they're going to sum that down to what, 3 lines on your ballot summary. You
It's
know,
really a
I mean,
joke. It's really a joke.
It
but
is
you know,
a joke.
I'm moderately hopeful now because the initial polling was all in favor, but the last poll was negative. And so, you know, I think to some degree, I'd like to believe the word is getting out in the last few weeks and beginning to change things, but also both sides are split. There are Republicans and Democrats all over the map on this because a lot of people don't know about a huge part of it, and others focus on one provision which they like and ignore another provision. This thing is so complicated and all over the place. It's got everyone scratching their head, and the other half that aren't scratching their head are hopped up about one part of it and don't know about another part of it. But right now, before I would have said it's likely to pass, but now it's beginning to look as though it can be defeated. But I think this is still very much in play, and it's important that the word get out.
Exactly, and my philosophy has always been, if you can't sum it up in a couple of lines so somebody can understand what you're talking about, vote no.
Yes, exactly. It's really a sort of an Obamacare in the sense that you have to pass it to find out what's in it, and you don't want to find out what's in it.
No, and the terrible part of it is a lot of what's in it is already in existence, and it's playing out for us. I think the interesting thing that one of the interesting things your book has brought out is the relationship towards Obama and the national government, not just local. I mean, we can scream and yell about the California laws and our own representatives and non-representatives, but to understand that this is really going on from the top down. And so not only are they changing the face of the country on this level, the whole national security issue and the strength of the country and our prestige and everything, I mean, they really are dramatically changing the face of the country, like it or not.
Well, that's right, and the other side of the coin is, for the states that aren't California, well, I do learn from the conservative radio folks about all sorts of things, and the conservative radio people obviously are very well informed about what's happening in their locality, but I have to say, as a general matter, outside of California, conservatives on the ground don't understand any of this. That's one reason I wrote the book. They don't understand the goals of the regionalist movement. They think of it as strictly an ecology movement.
Yeah.
And the other side is running rings around us. They have the foundation money. They have the organization. They have the sophistication. They have the goals. So one of the reasons I've written the book, and one of the things I'm going to be trying to just do as I speak to conservatives from my experience of having gone on these radio shows and talked to people at the grassroots, is to just tell conservatives they need to be aware of the existence of regionalism. They need to develop national resources that can go to the local people fighting the battle. So conservatives in general have to be more aware of what's happening at the grassroots in this country, and the grassroots people who are fighting these battles need to understand that Obama and the national government's in on it. All the ends have to connect with all the other ends. We still haven't connected the dots yet, so that's why I wrote it.
And you wrote the book, and I want to thank you very much for being with us. I hope you come back because there's lots more to talk about.
I'd love to.
Thank you. We will invite you back. We'll do it. The book is Spreading the Wealth, How Obama is Robbing the Suburbs to Pay for the Cities. Sentinel is the publisher. You can go to the website, nationalreview.com, and you can read other of his writings on this, especially on this proposition that we were talking about, Prop 31. We'll talk more about that. I'm Barbara Simpson. This is KSFO. Let's bring in Mimi Steele, who is calling, as I suspect you heard my interview with my guest, Stanley Kurtz, and you are certainly familiar with his work. Mimi, thank you very much for calling.
Barbara, I want to commend you for spending so much time with Stanley. I mean, this merits an hour plus with him. It's fantastic information, and it's important information to get out. And I just wanted to follow up on some of the things he said and put the local perspective on it.
Okay.
So first of all, in California, we already have regional governments. There are 17 regions. The state is divided into 17 regions. Our region happens to be controlled by two organizations, Metropolitan Transportation Commission, that deals with the highway funds, and the Association of Bay Area Governments. But every major metropolitan area in the state of California has this regional government in place. So it's in the wings, it's in waiting. It has a lot of power now, but it doesn't have as much power as it's going to have once what Stanley Kurtz talked about gets implemented.
Let me ask you just a quick question. How did it come about that the state was divided in 17 regions. Where did that come from? Do you know?
You know, I almost hate to say it, but it actually, I think, originated with Ronald Reagan. And the original concept behind it made sense. It was a way for highway funds, federal highway funds, to get distributed regionally. But what's happened is these organizations have just gotten mission creep, and they've morphed in these big behemoth things that are getting their nose into all kinds of business that they weren't originally intended to be in.
Okay, so that's why they're getting into the housing and all these other issues as well.
Yeah, so in California, I mean, we have the worst of all possible worlds, and we've talked about this in the past, where the California legislature passed a bill called SB 375 in 2008, and so for the first time in the state, there was a requirement to combine not just the transportation funds and figure out where those go, but to combine transportation, housing, and land use. So you put those three things together, and you have a massive top-down, central planning type government. And that's what we're facing now with this One Bay Area or Plan Bay Area that we've talked about in the past on your show. I wanted to make a couple other comments, too, if I could. Somebody was mentioning Menlo Park.
That was a letter I had gotten from, no, actually that was somebody sent me a clipping from the newspaper down in Menlo Park.
So let me tell you the backstory on that.
All right, you know what? Only because of time, let me take a quick break, and when we come back, you can give us the backstory on it. If you're just joining us, we're talking to Mimi Steele, and I'll tell you all about her when we get back. I'm Barbara Simpson. This is KS. Barbara Simpson here on Hot Talk 560 KSFO. We're following in the line of our last hour we had the author of the book, Stanley Kurtz, is the author of Spreading the Wealth, but we're talking about the changes already in California. We also talked about Proposition 31, which I have in front of me now, but one of the groups behind it says that their goal is fundamental change, and that's what they want to do. They want to fundamentally change California's government, and that's what is built into that bill. So just on the basis of that, off the top of my head, I'm going to vote no on it. But Mimi Steele is with us. We were talking about Menlo Park. Give us the background on that. Mimi, where that came from was one of my listeners sent me a clipping from the Palo Alto Daily Post, which was about the residents getting just furious about the fact that they were trying to push through building almost 2,000 new homes in this area of the city, and the people didn't know anything about it.
Yes, so we've been in touch with the Menlo Park people, and for those skeptics out there, I would recommend that you go to my website, bayarealiberty.org, and there's a tab there that says housing, and if you click on that tab, there's a link to the housing numbers from ABAG. Every single city, all 101 cities in the Bay Area have been given a quota by the Association of Bay Area Governments on how much housing and what types of housing, what income level of housing they have to put in their areas. And so what happened, the background on Menlo Park, sort of the backstory on that is, Pleasanton a couple years ago was sued by an organization called Urban Habitat. And Urban Habitat won this was where the citizens had said, we don't want any growth in Pleasanton, and Urban Habitat sued them and said, this is not fair. So the city lost the suit and didn't pursue it. So now what happened in Menlo Park was Urban Habitat went to Menlo Park and threatened them and said, if you don't comply, we're going to do to you what we did to Pleasanton. So there's a lot of extortion, arm twisting going on here. It's really disgusting.
Yeah, I mean, and this is, people, I'm talking about this article is in a small local paper, which is a terrific article, but you don't see it anywhere else. So people have no idea it's going on, and you're right, it is extortion. There's no question about it. But it's also extortion when the state says, if you don't do this, we're going to take away your transportation funds, or we'll take away your school funds if you don't change the core curriculum.
Absolutely. And, that's the reason we started the SF Bay chapter of Citizens Alliance for Property Rights. We're trying to organize people. The people on the other side are very well organized. They're very well funded. And government goes to people who show up. And we're not showing up as the taxpayers. So if they go to bayarealiberty.org, sign sign up on my mailing list. I send information out about meetings all around the Bay Area. As we get more momentum, we're trying to put teams together in the different cities. So there's a lot people can do. As Matt Grocott said earlier to you, very few people show up at these local government events, and so you can really make a big difference if you get out there.
Well, as I mentioned, I have I've been following up on the child abuse situation in the schools in the community of Moraga, where the one woman, now a woman, but when she was a student, she was raped by a teacher. And in fact, it was in the news all over the paper, and that's how I got onto it. But I've gone to both the school board meetings and the town council meetings, and honestly, there's nobody there. I'm the only one sitting in the audience with maybe one or two other people, and they leave because they get tired or bored. And I hang around and I find out the most interesting things, like about this core curriculum changes that are going on in the school board. Not a word about it in any of the newspaper coverage of that meeting. Nothing.
Yes, and we've been going to these One Bay Area meetings, and if you sit in those meetings, it's interesting what you pick up from there. And they're all talking about the sustainable community strategy, which is exactly what Stanley talked about being implemented in the second half of Obama's term. But it's here now. The infrastructure is already in place, and of course, California is crazy. We're leading the pack on this. I want to make a couple more quick comments. Open space, yes, it's definitely related to this, because on the one hand, you have people pushing for open space, which takes the land out of production, as you said earlier, and then these same people, like Greenbelt Alliance, are lobbying for affordable housing. So they're helping create the conditions that require the quote-unquote affordable housing. It's a very brilliant, diabolically brilliant strategy. And then one final thing, we network with people all around the country, and about 2 weeks ago I was talking to a group in New Hampshire, of all places, and they have found a plan called the Granite State Future. And guess what's in the plan? They read the fine print. And all the stuff that Stanley was talking about, where they present you these innocent-sounding documents that if you sign them, you're going to end up with the federal funds. But guess what? Here are the strings. The New Hampshire people, that 912 group out there, started reading the fine print, and now they are fighting like heck to get this, to make sure that their cities don't sign up for it, and they're still in the process.
Are you finding, I mean, you're a very active woman. You also have a full-time job, so I don't know quite how you do all of this, maybe, but you're very busy doing all of this. Are you finding that people are getting incensed about this, or are they just worn down to the point where they say, oh, the hell with it, I don't care? Nothing I can do, that kind of thing.
I think when people know about it, and I think you hit it the nail on the head a couple hours ago. When they know about it, number one, and number two, you give them something that they can do that's concrete. And, you can spend a lot of emotional energy writing to your congressman, and that isn't going to do you any good. But you can sit in front of your city council and start complaining to them. And that's why we have the Citizens Alliance for Property Rights. So if people would, I keep plugging that, but if they would go on and get my emails and then join up with other like-minded people, and hopefully we'll get even more like-minded people together, and we'll be able to fight this. And then one final thing, Stanley talked about an organization called Build One America.
Yes.
You can Google that and watch a video that they produced. I put it on my YouTube website, which you can get to by going to YouTube.com/SFBayCAPR. And I summarized a 20-minute video into 3 minutes and 50 seconds, and it's the Build One America people, Valerie Jarrett, up there talking about how they're going to make this happen. They need affordable housing. They need regional opportunity agenda. They're going to combat poverty by stopping urban sprawl, and urban sprawl means segregation. I mean, it's astounding what they're saying. And people better wake up, because it's getting to be the 11th or 12th hour here.
Yeah, no question. I also mentioned an email I'd gotten from a woman who was very upset about what they're doing in San Jose about taking out car lanes and putting in bike lanes. Yeah. So, I mean, and this is going on all over the Bay Area, and it's only when it hit her street that it suddenly dawned on her of what was going on.
Wake up, people. Go to that website, BayAreaLiberty.org, and click on the housing numbers.
Okay.
and then right there it'll send you to a link, and every single city you will see how much very low income, medium income, and high income housing you have to accommodate until 2022, I think, and then they're going to come out with more housing numbers after that.
Yeah.
So,
and the threat is, because I've heard my own town council people discussing it, that if you don't do it, they'll take away your transportation money. And by God, we need our transportation money, so we'll do whatever they say.
there you
So
go.
they got you. Thank you, Mimi Steele. Appreciate it. We'll stay in touch. And thanks for all your good work. I mean, she shouldn't get paid for this. This is a full-time job, but she also has a full-time job. Thanks, Mimi. Goodbye.